you bring up a good point, right? You mentioned quality of fights, and as boxing fans, diehard boxing fans, boxing enthusiasts in general, Showtime Boxing's been around, been doing it over 30 plus years, put on some great events, great pay-per-views. But when we think about the landscape of boxing, in terms of most recent, they're putting on more and more pay-per-views that don't necessarily warrant it. Not necessarily with Showtime, but what do you think, or how involved can you be with regards to how to break that trend, to make the best fights, and getting the Errol Spence versus Crawford, or getting the Benavidez versus Charlo, and fights like that? Like how involved are you in that aspect?
Well, I think there's two elements of that. One is recognizing that that pay-per-view is a necessary tool, and when used appropriately, it helps the sport function. It helps make fights happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. Just doing the math, even if you've got a relatively small pay-per-view, 200,000 buys, that's still over $12 million of revenue to the promotion. And that's more than any network is paying for a fight. So the reality, there are some fights that are going to need pay-per-view to make them happen. Now, the problem is when you're asking people to pay filet mignon prices and you're giving them ground beef. I mean, that is the problem. And it's certainly our desire and our goal every single time to avoid that. But the reality is properly used, pay-per-view is a good tool, and it allows fights to happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. Some networks have gotten into it and said, look, this is a cash grab, let's exploit one fighter and give you a bunch of junk and charge a bunch of money for that. That's not good for the sport. It's not good for the fans. And I'll be the first to say that that isn't something that anyone, whether Showtime or anyone else, should be doing to the fans. But I think if we, when we look at the card and we're getting close to announcing the whole thing, our goal is to put intriguing fights all the way down the card.
That's right. Well, let me ask you this, because again, you're very respected in the sport. So whenever, are you saying more so it's more of the managers, or is it more of the fighters? Because you mentioned, they're asking for filet mignon type prices. But at what point during negotiations do you guys can you walk the fight fans as far as the process of the steps that are taken as far as to dictate the pricing, as far as, hey, listen, this is where the value's at right now for this particular fight based off of this. Is it graphs? I mean, do you guys have analytics involved? How involved is that with the fighters and with the promoters? And are they just pricing themselves out to the point where they don't want to fight?
No, look, the reality is, every fighter has a sort of a purse history,
okay,
and purse expectations, and no one wants to move backwards. Nobody, when they take a new job, wants to make less than they were making on their old job, regardless of what the situation is.
Great point.
So you start there, and everyone wants to feel like they're being paid fairly, particularly when it's a high-risk fight and people are putting their safety at risk. So when a fight happens, there's a collective conversation with the promoters and with the network, and says, okay, what are the various revenue streams that are possible? What is the TV license fee if it's non-pay-per-view? What is international? What can happen? And saying, is that enough to meet the fighters' needs, in the main event and the undercard? Because again, promoters got to pay for an undercard too. Most of the time it's pretty, it's not that close a call. There are fights which are clearly non-pay-per-view fights, and there are fights where if they're going to happen, they're going to have to be on pay-per-view.
Exactly.
And the reality is, look, I understand that sometimes it can be expensive to be a fight fan, and our goal is to minimize the pay-per-views to the extent possible. But sometimes, given what the fighters are fair in asking for,
correct,
there's just no other way to pay for it other than to generate some additional revenues to pay-per-view.